Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. For centuries, sports stadiums have been a place for entertainment, culture, and of course, healthy competition. But what happens when the sports arena becomes a place for political expressions? What happens in a broader context when sports intersects with politics? On tonight's show, we discuss sports and the role it has played, can play, and should play in international relations and diplomacy. Joining us for this discussion today is Dr. Souvik Naha, who is a professor of sports history, joining us from England. We are also joined in the studios by Mr. Khalid Mahmood, who is the former chairman of Pakistan's cricket board. We are also joined by Raunak Kapoor, who is a sports broadcaster, joining us from Mumbai. Thank you all for joining us. Dr. Souvik, let me begin with you. Historically, can you tell us the role sports has played in international relations and diplomacy?
Yeah, sport has forever been a conduit of international relations and diplomacy. So if we go back to the 19th century, if we recall the origin of modern sports and the Olympic sports in South Asia, we will find out that all the sports that we play today, cricket, football, hockey, tennis, badminton, most of it, they were imported from England. They were started by English civilians who were here spread throughout the subcontinent. And most of the propagation of these sports in the subcontinent happened through the channel of a civilizing mission. So the British people really wanted the so-called citizens of the Indian subcontinent to be well versed in English culture. They wanted to inculcate the values of team spirit, discipline, and sacrificing one's need when the nation is more important.
Souvik, let me just fast forward a little. We are talking about how sports has played a role in diplomacy and international relations. But isn't it true in the past, especially when we talk about the 1980s, 1970s, whenever sports and politics intersected, it became very, very controversial?
Yeah, it has been, because sport has been a very important platform for nations to project a very positive self-image. Hitler's Germany used the Berlin Olympics in 1936 to do just that. The Argentinian junta military government, they were accused of violating human rights for 10 or 20 years. So they wanted the 1978 Football World Cup with Argentina to be a very successful projection of how good the country actually was. So they wanted sport as a platform, as a very emotive vehicle of the people to just project that whatever they have been doing is perfect, it's legitimate, and it's authentic. So that way, sport and international politics have been inseparable over the last 50 years or so.
So I'm going to take the next question to Mr. Raunak here. When we're talking the intersection of sports, we have seen that it has a controversial past, and it seems that every time it does intersect with politics, there is some controversy. Have we learned at all from history whether or not these two realms should ever come together?
I think there are two aspects to this, Meshal. Firstly, where does one stand on how much or what amount of political representation or commentary should be permissible on a sports field? And second, whether that's something that can be separated in reality. Personally, I'm not a fan of it. I do not believe that you should be that a sports field is the venue for political statements to be made.
Why?
I just think there's no line that can be drawn then. Because I think if you start getting into making political protests on a sports field, sport wasn't designed for military representation. It wasn't designed for players to wear army caps. It was not designed for someone to wear a wrist stating that they don't agree with what's happening in Palestine, in Gaza, like it was with Moeen Ali on a cricket field 5 years back. Where do you draw the line? In the US, they have their own set of domestic issues with the NFL players taking a knee to the anthem to protest their own government. So my personal opinion is it should stay away from the field, because sport serves a greater purpose than politics. And I hold sport to a higher standard than I hold politicians to. And I think it's important to make public statements, and sportsmen should not be afraid to. But I don't think the cricket field or the football field is the venue for it.
So, Mr. Khalid Mahmood, I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked Mr. Raunak here. Do you agree with what he's saying, that the stadium, the sports arena is no place for politics?
I couldn't agree more with him. Stadiums, sports arenas are not meant for politics. In fact, on the contrary, these events, these premises, these places are meant to bring people together. And they have addressed the controversial aspects of the sports diplomacy quite at length. But I would be referring to the positive aspects of sports diplomacy in particular. If you recall, in the late 60s, the Americans had a ping pong diplomacy with the Chinese.
Yeah.
On the pretext of sending a ping pong team, they were actually negotiating with them. And as a result of that, the world saw that the two countries, superpowers, who were quite hostile to each other, came closer with each other. Similarly, in case of Pakistan, India, which we are more concerned at the moment, if you recall, I think it was in the late 80s when a Pakistan cricket team was touring India. Then President of our country, General Ziaul-Haq, he visited India, and on the pretext of seeing cricket matches, he had quite useful discussions with the Indian leadership, and as a result of that, there was a reduction in hostilities.
Yeah.
So therefore, sports certainly has nothing to do with politics. It should not have anything to do with politics, and not only it is the case of conventions and traditions of the sports, particularly cricket. You know, anything unfair being done in the field of cricket, they always say this is not cricket.
So, Mr. Khalid, let me pull up that event that happened recently where the Indian cricket team wore caps, which stirred quite a controversy. And even though the International Cricket Council has stated that players and team officials are not permitted to convey political statements through clothing, and they had formerly also banned another cricket player, Moeen Ali, who had worn wristbands protecting Gaza and Palestine, trying to promote that cause. Where do you see the hypocrisy here? Is it hypocrisy? And how do you think that is playing out?
Well, you are using a very mild word. It's very shameful double standard of the ICC. Shameful double standard of the ICC. Moeen Ali example you have cited. There could be a few other examples, but just to cut short. Point is, it is against the tradition of the game. It is against the conventions of the game. It is against the history of the game. And you forget about all these things. These traditions, history, conventions can be violated and have been violated in the past. But the rules of the ICC, as made by the IC itself, cannot be violated.
Okay.
First thing is, just two more sentences. First thing is, ICC does not mean an employee of ICC, an official of ICC. Even the chief executive, I would not consider ICC. I've been member of the ICC board of directors as chairman of the Pakistan Cricket Board. It is that prestigious and august body who have the authority to take decisions on such matters. So nobody can take a decision. Nobody can violate the laws and rules of the ICC, which have been violated in case of this particular instance.
So why do you think this shameful double standard was not realized by the ICC itself? Why do you think action was not taken? Why do you think there was protection given here?
Well, you see, I will try to be very brief about it. You see, money makes the mayor go. Actually, it's all now a question of money, more money coming to the cricket playing countries. That is why they had all that discussion about the big three thing and revamping ICC, all that, so that more money could be passed on to the three major cricket playing countries, which is Australia, England, the two founding members, and then India. Now, India has a very, very strong corporate sector, and cricket is like religion in that country, and that corporate sector is mad about it, very enthusiastic about it, and they contribute as much as possible, not only in the local tournaments, home matches, but also in the world events. So therefore, most of the money is contributed by the Indian corporate sector. And whosoever is contributing that kind of money is calling the shots. And that is why ICC is sort of compelled to indulge in a behavior which is double standard.
Mr. Khalid, so Raunak also wants to engage with the conversation we're having in the studio. Mr. Raunak, you're hearing whatever Mr. Khalid had to say. What do you have to say about it?
Yeah, I agree with Mr. Khalid to the degree that it does come across as hypocrisy when you suspend or ban one player for making a political statement and you actually sanction and give permission to an entire team to do just that. Just for as far as the facts are concerned, and you can of course read in the lines and draw your own conclusions, the ICC said it granted permission because the BCCI said it was an act of charity that India was engaging in, and it was true to the extent that the Indian captain said that proceeds from that game would be donated to the National Defence Fund. Personally, that's where it should have ended. It should have been proceeds to the fund. They could have had a charity game or a benefit game for the armed forces. There are many ways in which you can
yeah, exactly. Isn't there many other ways that you can contribute without having overt political?
Absolutely, and that's where the ICC should have drawn the line and said, look, we're letting you have, it's perfectly fine to have a charitable event. The captain could have made a statement in the pre-match toss and made a statement. They could have done social media, etc. Wearing a cap that represents warfare is pushing it a bit too much, and it is in violation of the ICC's own rules when it comes to the conduct and the clothing conduct that they're supposed to adhere to. To the part that Mr. Mahmood talks about the clout that India enjoys in the ICC, that's no secret. Of course, it's a very powerful board, but I don't think it's to the degree that it'll be able to bend the ICC's arm at every possible point. Otherwise, there was talk recently that India wanted Pakistan boycotted or removed from the World Cup, and there should be an apartheid sort of situation where everyone must boycott Pakistan. I don't see that having any merit, and in spite of the clout India holds with the ICC, I don't think that will ever happen, and that should not happen. There is a significant case for India to say that we don't want to play Pakistan if that's how strongly the board feels, but it is completely out of line to suggest to a global sporting body that it should be boycotting a particular nation on the basis of their own political hostility.
That's a very strong point you make there, Mr. Raunak. I want to ask Dr. Souvik Naha here, when we're talking about sports and political expressions during it, what does history tell us about how that reconciles with the idea of freedom of expression?
Yeah, athletes have been known to make political statements on the field of play, because if you remember the 1968 Mexico Olympics, after the 200-meter sprint was over, the two people on the podium, after just receiving the medals, they just did the
Tommy Smith and John Carlos.
Right, Tommy Smith and John Carlos. They did the Black Power salute, fully knowing that it was banned under the International Olympic Committee's code of conduct, and they still went ahead with it because they were looking at the bigger picture of political repression of the blacks in the US and in other parts of the world. So they just wanted to make a very strong political statement, and the Olympic medal podium was the perfect place to do that. They were sanctioned, they were banned for the next 2 years, they couldn't run. But still, they had the temerity to do that. And after that, Muhammad Ali, the famous boxer, he refused to join the Vietnam War. Even he faced sanction. He was out of the ring for 3.5 years. But still, he went ahead with it. So sometimes it's important to make this kind of political statements, because like sport, politics also a part of human consciousness. So you can't really separate the two at one point.
Thank you so much, Mr. Naha, for joining us and talking to us. Mr. Raunak, on that point, you mentioned earlier that it should be separate. The two realms must be divorced, but in practicality, that might not happen. And that's something that Dr. Naha also reiterated here. Can you tell us, do you think in the past decade or so, or even in the recent history, you think that intersection of politics and sports has increased?
I think when it comes to cricket, there is an obvious connection between sports and politics because of the amount of politicians that are involved in sport. Definitely in India, most certainly in Sri Lanka, probably in Pakistan as well. Maybe you and Mr. Khalid would shed better light on it. But I know that politicians love getting involved with cricket because of the high profile and the public profile that it carries. And when politicians get involved with the sport, they tend to play out their own agendas, which can be seen on a larger scale. But that's just one aspect of it. The other aspect is that there are a lot of cricketers now, a lot of sportsmen that tend to genuinely feel like the sports field is their political podium. Now, are you going to convince Colin Kaepernick in the USA that he should not be protesting against the president on a field of play? Are you going to convince Moeen Ali that in spite of how strongly you feel, you're not allowed to wear a wristband for something that you feel strongly about? So I guess it's a mix to do with the fact that there's always been an infiltration of politicians in sport, and secondly, that the modern player most certainly feels entitled to carry his political sleeve on the field of play.
And the question here is that entitlement, they must also have, because of them being, by virtue of them being public figures, they could also use that power outside of the stadium as opposed to within it.
Yeah, they could. You could argue that they could, but how much of an impact would that make? If Moeen Ali would simply put out tweets and messages as against actually wearing something on a field of play. If the Indian Indian team would merely say, let's donate to the Indian Army in a charity event, as against wear caps on a live cricket match that's being broadcast to millions of people around the world. It's the impact of the statement that's being made, I guess. In some cases, you may agree with the politics. In some cases, you may not. I agree with the politics of it with the NFL players in the US. I do not agree with the politics of it when it came to India's incident recently against Australia. But that's not the point. The point is, regardless of what your political beliefs are, the sports ground is not the place to devise them. Call these players out. Let's have discussions, debates, social media, news channels, n number of opportunities and platforms to discuss where you stand on a political subject. Let's keep sport out of it. That's just where I stand personally.
So I take your point there, and I have registered it. I want to ask Mr. Khalid Mahmood here. Raunak did mention how he supports the political expression of the NFL players, but he does not see it in the same light when the Indian cricket players did it. Do you personally think that some political expressions are acceptable in the sports arena, or none at all?
Before I answer your question, I would like to compliment our guest from India for his very, very logical and reasonable views. And I thank him for that. Otherwise, it would have been a just pointless debate. I have very closely followed his comments. I think where there is any individual expression of any political thinking, if it is not very sound, very obvious, very noisy sort of thing, perhaps there could be some scope to ignore it. But in this particular situation, I would not blame the Indian players at all. Let me tell you, this is my view. I would not blame the Indian players at all. I would blame the Indian Cricket Board, who are a responsible organization, who are members and very, very influential, powerful member of the ICC, who understands the intricacies and sensitivities of this problem. And they are the ones who made their players put on those caps. They didn't do that on their own. So they were bound by a discipline, and they followed that discipline. So I would like to really criticize the Indian Cricket Board that why did they have to do that? There were various other ways of showing solidarity with their armed forces. I know the nationals of Pakistan and the nationals
Mr.
of
Khalid,
India. So they could have done it in many other ways.
Yeah, so let me ask you this. When we have clearly a politicization of international sports organizations, how do you think sportsmen can fare to that? How do you think they can stand strong if they do not want to make political expressions? Do you think they ever have a choice?
They always have a choice. Actually, you can't really force the sportsmen to do something which is against their will, which is against the rule, which is against the tradition. But it is, on the contrary, the other situation where they are moved and motivated by their own emotions and sentiments, and they feel very strongly about some situation, as it appears that perhaps the Indian players felt about it. So they have a right to do that, but there the right ends. On the field, I think they have to be good sportsmen and outstanding cricketers, some of the Indian players are. On the ground, they have to show the best traditions of the game rather their political emotions and all that. No.
Mr. Raunak, Mr. Khalid previously mentioned ping pong diplomacy and how diplomacy does not always have to have an adverse effect on sports. So in this light, do you feel like sports can be an instrument to further diplomacy, and do you think it should be?
if it ends up being if diplomacy ends up being a byproduct of bilateral sport, then so be it. But sport doesn't need to be the platform for political diplomacy. Look, things can even get worse when sportsmen get involved with politics. So if by virtue of having bilateral ties, bilateral sport, there is some form of hostility that is reduced, that's all well and good. But I don't think sports should be organized for the sake of looking at political hostilities being reduced. That's where I stand on this, on what you just asked me. Just going back to it, it's not about the difference of whether I agree with the politics or not. That's my whole point. It's that's not the place to decide it. If we all start getting into what we get along with and what we like and what we don't like, as per what sportsmen do in a sports field, we lose the entire essence of why we play sport. Sport should be rid of it for the sake of sport, is just how I stand personally. And to just finish off on what Mr. Khalid said regarding this incident, I understand his criticism of the Indian board. This was actually done at the behest of MS Dhoni, who is an honorary lieutenant colonel in the Indian Territorial Army, and he feels very strongly about making a statement. So it was actually done at the behest of one player, and the Indian board followed its due process and asked the ICC, and the ICC gave permissions. For me, the entire thing of it didn't work on a cricket field. I think the ICC should have said, you're allowed to make it an event for charity, but we're not going to let you break the code of the uniforms that we have to adhere to. So I think there's a little bit of collective responsibility that everyone needs to take up. And I hope everyone gets smarter with going forward.
Yeah, and can you just take us through, you've been loudly advocating, and rightfully so, your point of view that it should, the politics should not be happening on the sports field. Can you take us through what you have witnessed happening to sports in general when conflict occurs and when it is dragged into politics? How does it harm the sport?
Okay, let me put it this way. It's almost like with the way sport is devised, it's impossible to start making it a platform for political hostility, because then it just becomes impractical to carry out sport events. In 2003, in the World Cup, the English team refused to travel to Zimbabwe because of ongoing tensions and embargoes that the British government had put on the Robert Mugabe regime. So they didn't end up traveling, and Zimbabwe got 3 points, England didn't. There were safety concerns in '96 when Australia didn't travel to Sri Lanka, in 2003 when New Zealand didn't travel to Kenya. And I think if you start opening this box of everyone deciding on the basis of their political relations with another nation whether or not they're going to play sport with them, I don't think so. So I think sport shouldn't be used and misused and abused by those in power to make political statements that they can't make off the sports field. Keep the sportsmen to do what they were supposed to do, play the sport.
Yeah, and just adding on to your comments on it too, Raunak, Shashi Tharoor, an Indian politician, former UN Under Secretary General, wrote recently, sport can sublimate many emotions, but it cannot be a substitute for geopolitics. Cricket can be an instrument for diplomacy, not an alternative to it. So in light of everything that is happening, and it seems like what you're saying as well, do you think governments are using sports as a replacement for diplomacy?
Well, you could say that. I think Mr. Tharoor's dead on. You can't say that because you can't find dialogue on the political front, that let's just have sports so that might diffuse tensions, because those don't address the real issues anyway. I can understand a board making a statement and saying, no, we are so unhappy with the government of Pakistan that we will not play Pakistan in bilateral cricket. That, I think, is a call that a board and a government is entitled to make. But I do not believe, I think it just crosses the line of silliness if you're going to say at a global event, at a World Cup. Imagine the World Cup semi-final in 2011 if India would have just said, we're not going to play Pakistan, we're not going to let them come to Mohali for the semi-final, we're not going to, I remember the Prime Minister of Pakistan was there at that point, and along with our Prime Minister, they watched the game together. It made a really good statement. At that point, all of a sudden, there was dialogue initiated. So it was a byproduct, right? But if India stood at that point, or if Pakistan stood at that point and said, we're not going to travel to India, or if India said, we're not going to grant visas to Pakistan's players, I think it would have just crossed the line of stupidity. So for me, the politicians have to do their own job. Let's not put the cover on the failures of our politicians by saying that the way out for them is that they've managed to sever ties in cricket or in any sport. I think that's giving them a very easy ticket. Keep the sport going as is and make sure the politicians do their job.
Yeah. You've made a great point there, Mr. Raunak, and thank you so much for joining us and talking to us. We're going to take a short break. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Indus Special. While we continue our discussion, we are now joined by Vikrant Gupta, who is executive editor at Aaj Tak, joining us from Delhi. Thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Vikrant, while we're talking about the role of sports and politics, let me ask you this. Do you think sports is a useful tool when it comes to soft power and diplomacy?
Well, indeed, there were times when you did not want to mix sports politics, but I don't think we live in an ideal world now.
So, Mr. Vikrant, what you were saying is that in an ideal world, sports should be separated from diplomacy. But when we see that sportsmen have so much following and they can actually make an impact, do you think that it's still ideal to separate those two?
See, why is it up to the sportsmen to connect the two bridges? My point is, why is it only the sportsperson? The politicians have more following. Me and you have equal following. Why can't we do that? So if the politicians are not able to do it, if there is cross-border terrorism, then it becomes difficult for the sportspersons also. Hypothetically, I was in Switzerland last year for the ice cricket. 3 Pakistani players were there. Shoaib Akhtar was there. Shahid Afridi was there. And I remember there was an incident while I was taking an interview of Shahid Afridi. There was an Indian family who had come for pictures, and the Indian tricolor just fell down on the ice, and Shahid Afridi was the one who picked it up. That was an ideal world. But now, after what happened in Pulwama, it will be very, very difficult for sports to act as a bridge. See, sports will be sports. Sports cannot drive a country. Sports can be the fun. Sports can inspire or motivate the country, but they cannot run the country. For policies to be framed, for the policies to be re-understood, you will need politicians, you will need political circles. And there has to be an intent at the political level, which unfortunately the sports persons can't carry out.
Yeah. So let's move on to a more positive note here. How do you think sports brings countries together?
Well, we've seen it before. I remember when India went to Pakistan in 2004, I was one of the touring journalists, and I was very happy being in Pakistan for close to 50 days. Then Pakistan came to India in 2005, and we hosted the Pakistanis, the fans, the media, the players. Everybody went home happy. So there are instances. I remember General Zia came to India to watch one day of a test match in 1987. Your Prime Minister had come to watch the World Cup semi-final at Mohali in 2011. So, there have been instances. Sports can actually bridge. But as I said, the moment you cross the line, I think we've crossed that line long before. The moment there is cross-border terrorism or there is mutual distrust for the other, then it becomes difficult for the sports to interfere.
Yeah. And Mr. Khalid, I want to ask you here, we have been talking about how politicization of the sport affects sportsmen, but how does it affect the audience in any specific way? How does it distinctly affect those who are watching the sport?
Well, you see, audience are not under any regulations except a civilized behavior, which is generally expected of decent human beings. So you can't really discuss them in this context. They would be affected, some would be affected, some would not be affected. There would be some who would be so much affected that they would be creating problems in a cricket stadium or a sports stadium. So then there are rules to handle them. So I don't think we need to discuss the audience as much as we should be discussing the sports bodies and the sportsmen.
Yeah.
I think basically I quite agree that sports cannot be a substitute for politics. Politics has its own position, it has its own role. But I would maintain one thing very strongly, that politics should not be allowed to impact or influence sports. Politics should not be interfering in the sports matter. Sports matter should be conducted as per the respective regulations of that particular sport. Those should not. But sports has definitely a role in creating a congenial and proper friendly atmosphere between countries. In that sense, sports has this very, very important role, that it can reduce tensions, it can at least create an environment where problems can be discussed, as has been happening between India and Pakistan in the past, and it should continue to happen. So if the sports bodies or the individual sportsmen, and I concede that they have their emotions, they have their sentiments, they have their opinions on particular incidents and issues, as everybody has a right to have such issues, and as our friend from India was referring again and again to the incident in Kashmir, and he has his views. He is welcome to those views. I have also my views on that, but I would not refer to them. I would restrict myself to this particular subject, and therefore I would suggest that sports should not be interfered by the politicians. But sports should be allowed to create an environment which improves the relations between people and the country.
Definitely.
That's the role of sportsmen. And if individual sportsmen have any emotions to express, they should observe the rules of the game, and such emotions should be expressed outside the sports arena.
Definitely. We're also joined by Lieutenant General Arif Hassan, who's the President of Olympic Association, joining us from Karachi. Thank you so much, Mr. Arif Hassan, for joining us. Let me ask you this. When we talk about sports diplomacy, do you think it only happens when there is a failure of conventional diplomacy, and that's why politicians need to resort to this form of diplomacy?
If I've understood you correctly, Gia, you faded out a little. But as far as sports are concerned, and I was listening in to, I think it was Khalid sir, sports basically, as you said, is a vehicle which can be used for the promotion of peace. It's not the end by itself, but it's definitely a very big vehicle which can be used for peace. As far as sport itself is concerned, as I'm talking about the Olympics, basically the basic principle of the Olympics is a message of peace. And this is enshrined in the charter, the Olympic Charter, and right from the beginning, since the inception of the Games, it is that world peace was declared, or at least peace was declared in the area, which is also known as Arakaria, where all the warring tribes and city-states, etc., declared peace so that the athletes could travel in peace and participate in the Games. And that is the basic underlying factor on which the Olympism is built. And therefore, we strongly advocate that sports must be used for the promotion of peace. If you will just allow me to go a little further, diplomacy is known the world over. We have heard in football the two Arab players who played for Israel became heroes after scoring the goals, and so on. And this is what the basis of sports is. Now, sports should not be used for any other means except for the development of peace, of your own human resources, etc.
So you're saying that it should only be used for the development of peace. Mr. Vikrant, let me ask you this. So when we're saying sports should not intersect with politics at all, is it fair to say that for some causes it's justified to use that platform, and for some causes it is not?
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. In fact, Meshal, I was listening to Khalid Bhai, and I think he had his points. He was absolutely right. There are situations that you deal with. What we are talking now may have been good to talk a couple of years ago. Maybe 6 months down the line, we'll be talking the same sense. But right now, as I said, you also have to take into account the atmosphere. I'm not saying that sitting here in India, I'm blaming Pakistan. But if there is mutual distrust between the two countries, then sports can't do anything. Just take the example of the BCCI, for example. BCCI and PCB were together in the 80s. When they fought the Imperial Cricket Council, they got the World Cup in Asia. They got the money in Asia. And Asia became powerful. India became powerful. Pakistan became powerful. They were friends. The same BCCI now writes to the ICC that Pakistan or countries from where the terror emanates should be banned from playing cricket. Now, that is not valid. That is not valid. BCCI does not have the right to go to the ICC and tell them that Pakistan cricket team should be banned. At the same time, when the Indian players were wearing those army caps, Pakistan's name was not taken. and they just said that we'd be donating our matches to the.
But it did reveal a sort of a hypocrisy because the ICC has banned previously certain players from making political expressions in the similar way.
Meshal, I was making my point clear. I said when the Indian players were wearing the caps to show solidarity with the martyrs, Pakistan also went and complained to the ICC, even though there are rules within the ICC which allowed the Indians to wear the caps.
Okay,
the cap has
so
nothing to do with
Mr.
Pakistan.
Vikrant, stay with me. I've registered your point. I also want to ask Mr. Khalid his response to what you've stated. Whatever Mr. Vikrant has said that Pakistan had no business to go and complain to the ICC, how would you respond to that? How do you see that?
Well, unfortunately, to respond to this, I have to explain to you and to our friend from India the political message which goes through displaying the army caps by the players. You see, Pakistan has a point of view on that. Pakistan feels that it is an internal job of the Kashmiris who are being wronged by the Indian government. So, to fight for their freedom, they have a right to take whatever measures they find necessary. On the other hand, India feels that it is something done by an organization in Pakistan, and therefore they are protesting against it. So the political message certainly goes by putting on those caps. That means you are supporting the point of view of your government and your people. So that political message is there. So therefore, when it is a contravention and violation of the ICC rules, each member country has a right to raise that issue with the ICC, because it is certainly a violation of the ICC rules, which does not permit any such.
Khalid bhai, I would beg to differ. I would beg to differ on that, because there was no political message A. And B, when you say that the Indian players are standing with the Indian government, there's nothing wrong in that. I remember when Misbah and his team did those push-ups for the army Jawans, the Pakistan army Jawans at the Lodge. We in India appreciated that. That was appreciated. And what did the Indian players do? They just said that in respect of the Pulwama martyrs, people who were killed were not terrorists. Pulwama, the CRPF Jawans died. So why is it that the Indian players do not have the right to condemn them? Pakistan wasn't named, sir. That's what I'm trying to say. See, that's the point. Pakistan is right and India is wrong, or India is right and Pakistan is wrong. The moment we get into that, then this entire business of sports being sports and diplomacy not to be interlinked, it gets lost. That's my point.
I respect your views, but let's try to explain my point of view. If Misbah Haq did something at Lords which was in violation of the rules, I would not support him. Misbah Haq and his colleagues were doing some exercise. I don't think they made any statement about it. They simply said they were exercising. It was the media and certain other persons, they said they were trying to thank the trainers who had trained them to do the exercise. So therefore, if somebody is doing some exercise and is not even talking about it, or is not even attributing it to any particular organization, I don't think any objection could be raised to that. As regards the incident at your cricket stadium where the players put on the army cap, certainly that conveys a political message in the sense that they are supporting the contention of the government and the people. They have a right to have the same views and same feeling as their government has, but I don't think the ICC rules permit them to express those views or those sentiments on the cricket ground. That is the only difference.
They had the ICC's prior permission.
Mr. Vikrant, let me ask you this, just jumping into here, into the
the ICC sent out an advisory saying that the Indian board had approached them for two things. A, they wanted to wear the caps in memory of the martyrs, and B, they wanted to do some charity fundraising, which they did. Now, if that was illegal and the push-ups were legal, that is something beyond me. Then why do we have special clothes for Pink Bay Test match at the Sydney or in South Africa or the pollution games that we have in IPL? Then the players have no right to change their uniforms, their caps. If the ICC was in agreement, I think, sir, is illegal. That's what I'm trying to say. And no cricket country or any sane cricket country would have listened to the BCCI. But that was just posturing. I know that. Even the Pakistan Cricket Board, by complaining to the ICC, is just playing to the gallery. So sports is also playing to the national sentiment. The sports bodies are now doing posturing, which is unnecessary. Both the countries, I would say.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vikrant Gupta, for joining us and taking your time out to talk to us. Mr. Khalid Mahmood, let me wind up this discussion. What would your last message be to the audience watching here, given the entire discussion we've had?
My very, very specific, definite message would be, let politics not influence sports. Let the politicians not have the right to intervene in what is going on in sports field. Sports should be conducted as per its own traditions, as per its own regulations, as per its own rules, and let sports be conducted naturally as per traditions of the game, and let sports be allowed to create an environment which can bring the people together, which can bring the nations together, and which can create an environment which is useful for cementing relationships and removing differences.
Yeah. So, of course, you've shown how you have strongly disagreed with what Mr. Vikrant was saying earlier, that in fact was a political message. Thank you so much, Mr. Khalid Mahmood, for joining us. Thanks for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week. Goodbye and take care.